Mess Life Coach, Season 5, Episode 2. I'm your host, Brian Hogan, both a hot mess and a life coach, and I'm here with my co-host, Morgan Barbrett, and we are here today to talk more about emotions, specifically getting into the nitty-gritty about anger, how it's good, how it's bad, what it is, why it's here, and what, pray tell, do we do about it, if anything. Good morning, Mo.
Morning, Brian. I was telling Brian right before we hopped on here that this is probably my favorite emotion, or the one that I'm most excited to talk about. And part of the reason for that is because anger gets a really bad rap in our culture. A lot of times it gets strongly associated with just violence or aggression or power exertion, things that we find to be pretty negative. But anger also has a lot of positives to it. It also has a lot of benefits to us when we're able to feel it. But the tricky thing is to be able to feel it in a balanced way, to be able to express it in a balanced way so we don't let it get out of control, so that it, gets expressed in its more negative forms.
Yeah, exactly. Anger has a marketing problem. It has a reputation issue.
Yeah, right.
It is
Yeah.
deeply misunderstood. Anger, it, one of the things that I read this week about anger that struck me was that it's the precursor of anger in mammals is a perception of vulnerability plus a threat,
Okay.
which I find to be really interesting. So, like, the more vulnerable people and animals feel, the more there's a threat perceived, and the function of anger is to protect vulnerability and neutralize
Mm,
threat.
yeah.
But in order for us to do that, to come online and be motivated to do that, we need to feel that feeling that would
Hmm.
that would bring us up to want to protect, right? And that brings me to like the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of anger, right? It is a strong feeling of displeasure or hostility, which,
Mm,
like, I think anger, there's more to it than that. So that definition leaves a little to be desired for me. But at the
yeah.
base foundational level, a strong feeling of displeasure or hostility is going to motivate me to protect my vulnerable self and neutralize the threat. So that makes sense,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes.
And
Go ahead.
I want to say one last thing, and this is
Mhm.
so because that dictionary definition left a little to be desired for me. I went and looked up like the origin of, like, where it comes from, and like it has these
Yeah.
Latin and Greek roots in the same root as angst, which I
Hmm.
found to be really interesting. And so then I looked up the dictionary definition of angst, which is painful sadness or emotional turmoil, which actually
Mm.
goes right to the heart of what you and I were talking about just prior to going live, which is how anger is oftentimes a shield for
Yes.
harder and more difficult to feel emotions, because anger
Yeah.
is oftentimes outwardly focused and reactive, and comes with a discharge of emotion that can even help us feel calm after. So in that sense, it's a benefit. But that whole catharsis that we get from expressing anger can completely allow us to sidestep whatever was the precursor that caused us to feel vulnerable and threatened, which may have been a
Hmm.
feeling of guilt or shame or remorse or grief. And then we can
Right.
sidestep that one and go only with anger.
Yeah. Yeah. So anger, like other emotions, it has a purpose, it serves a function. And one of those functions Brian just described, which is if we have uncomfortable, difficult emotions that we're unwilling to feel or don't really have like the skills or coping mechanisms to be able to feel uh, comfortable or okay with processing more difficult emotions like shame, like guilt, and especially grief, then if we resist those other emotions, then all that's left to, I suppose, process some of that or release some of the energy that is built up from those more negative emotions is anger. And so, in a way, um, anger is a sign that there may be other negative emotions underneath. Sometimes it's just anger. Sometimes something just like makes you angry. But for the most part, usually it's a sign that there are other emotional things going on underneath that. Um, but it also is a super good coping mechanism because if we didn't have another way to release the tension of those emotions, that energy would have to go somewhere else, which means it probably would manifest in the form of some sort of, physical illness if that energy didn't have a way to uh, be released from our body. So the release, which is one of the benefits of anger, is actually beneficial to our health. But it's, we also want to recognize that there could be other emotions underneath that. And that if we are able to feel those, then we likely will not have a strong, constant disposition of anger. So somebody who's angry all the time, while anger is a good coping mechanism, it's also healthy to look at what might be underneath that and process that, so that you're not walking through your life with a constant film of anger and stress on you.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is actually a good time then to bring up like sort of anger, like responsive present moment anger versus
Mhm.
chronic anger. And like I want to go back a step. You said sometimes like anger is it's there to it's keeping you from necessarily having to be overwhelmed by other negative emotions. I just
Yeah.
want to say I would call them difficult emotions because
Yeah.
even those ones that are underneath, like they're not negative. They also have a message. Like every
They also
emotion
have a
is like a
purpose.
messenger. It has a purpose. It's like the whole emotional system is like there to guide us and to make us more
Yeah.
informed. But the problem for me is like in our culture, we are taught to distance ourselves from emotions, generally speaking, which
Hmm.
means what we're really being taught is to distance ourselves from this beautiful, inherent, almost divine magnetic guidance that we have inside us. And that applies to quote unquote the negative emotions too. Like they're just as good at being a guide. They just don't
Hmm.
feel as exciting, but they're just as effective at being a compass. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so when when you were talking too about anger, like if it becomes chronic, then it changes to a pattern that's no longer serving you helpfully, even though the origin of your anger may have served a really beautiful purpose. Like maybe when you originally got angry, it was a way to set a boundary from something that should not have been happening to you. And then you held that boundary strong. And now, decades later, if you're still experiencing that anger, that's like a chronic form of anger. That experience of the anger in a chronic way isn't having the benefits that the responsive anger did have, which would be to
Right.
release the energetic ties or to help clarify boundaries with somebody. Oftentimes,
Mhm.
after an angry exchange, if it's done appropriately and without violence, you can actually have more deeper understanding with people, like with whom you feel
Right.
safe. But the reason I'm bringing all that up is because it reminds me of like we talk about as a child you can develop a coping strategy as a kid and then it no longer serves you. Like it made me think of like disassociation and how we all think of disassociation as like it's getting in the way of my healing, it's so problematic, I keep blanking out, I'm just trying to understand. And that's true now as a 40-year-old, 20 years out from the trauma, right? But
Hmm.
back in the day when I was a kid, that disassociation was a miracle. It was
Yeah.
like, and thank God I had it, right? For all kids, like thank God we have that in order to
Mhm.
cope with the current state of things in our society. And at a certain point, it's no longer useful. It's just like my action figure that gave me such joy. And then when I'm 19, I'm like, this is plastic and I wasted $8. It's just no longer, it's not as important. It becomes less important.
Right.
And that's true of disassociation. It's true of our chronic anger, which is sort of like a sometimes can come from grudge holding and you know what that is and then you have the exact thing you need to work through, and sometimes we're like I don't know why I'm just angry still, and that's maybe a little bit more difficult, but still that can be understood and discovered and worked through also.
Yeah. A lot of times a common source of chronic anger is anger towards the self that you don't recognize. Like
Ooh,
I this makes me think of like one of my favorite characters from this TV show that I watched when I was a kid, Avatar: The Last Airbender. There's this character named Zuko, and he's a firebender, and I'll get into why anger is like fire, but he gets banished as a child by his father from the Fire Kingdom or whatever, and
sorry.
and like the entire series, he's like furious at everyone. He's angry at every single person that he interacts with. And there's like this moment late in the series where his sister, who is a bitch, um, is like pushing him and asking him like, what is your problem? Why are you so angry? And he says, I think who I'm really angry at is myself.
Mm.
And so under a lot of people's chronic anger is anger directed towards themselves, and that frustration then gets externalized and other people pay the price for that anger that's directed towards the self.
Yeah, exactly. And that is a very difficult place to be. And then there again, I think is another example, like I think of why anger gets such a bad rap and is so misunderstood because like speaking for my own environment, like the anger that I encounter in my world for the most part is chronically angry people that have
Yeah.
that disposition, not necessarily in
Mm-hmm.
my closest circles, but like when I am exposed to anger, it's often that. It's like someone who just has a negative film over the world. And like
Mm-hmm.
I think that is part of why we find it so hard to have clarity around anger's benefits because we
Yeah.
see all around us destruction being caused and we think that that's being caused by anger, but actually it's being caused by like anger's more destructive cousin, resentment, which is like it's this more low grade thing that feels angry but it lasts for a long time, whereas like
Mm-hmm.
technically speaking anger is meant to be a burst of energy and a release and then to
That's
process.
protective.
Yeah, exactly. That's protective or informational or some motivational. Yeah, something along those lines. And then it
Yeah.
did that has that 90-second shelf life, right? And then
Yeah.
resentment, which somehow transcends the rules of that and has a 90-year shelf life if you let it.
Yes, true. So I want to talk about why anger is like fire, just very briefly, and then I think we
Yeah.
should go a little more into detail of the benefits of anger because I feel like most people's associations with anger are negative.
I think
So
you're right. And I've been feeling like even in these 12 minutes, like we came on this show to love up anger. And we started with all the reasons why it's hard and problematic. So we're even products of our culture here too.
yes, 100%,
I'm with you
100%.
there. Yeah, let's do that.
So, yeah, so anger is like fire because when it's left unchecked, when it's in an uncontrolled, unrestricted kind of environment, it can be incredibly destructive. It can burn and harm everything around it. But when it is controlled, when it is in check, then like when we can control it well, it's a really powerful tool. It's actually a tool that we need in order to balance out our lives. Like life without fire, not great. I don't think that the human race would be like surviving at this point. But um
But life with too
and
much fire, also not
life
great.
with too much fire, no, not we don't want that. We're seeing that in the globe right now.
That's right.
Um but so when anger is in check, when it is being processed well, that's when you start to see a lot of the benefits. And the first benefit that we, kind of mentioned before is that it's protective. If someone crosses a boundary or if someone seems to devalue who we are or not respect us, anger is a natural response to try to regain getting our needs met, being respected by other people, having our boundaries be um, met or respected. It really is like it protects us against everything. And that's a natural, like our body's natural response to protect us. So that's one.
It
Another
comes
one,
it comes
oh,
from
go
the
ahead.
primal fight reflex. Like it's
Yeah.
directly wired into our nervous system. That's how much we can't divorce ourselves from the protective nature of anger.
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So another one, and this is my favorite, and I actually had a positive association with anger when I was younger. I still do. I still do. But my my positive association with anger came from my connection with indignation. So
Mm.
like when I was being raised, like I learned a lot about like injustices in society and how people get treated poorly, which we also have a lot of that going on in the world right now. Indignation is a form of anger that is the appropriate response to injustice and unfairness. So
Yeah.
when people are being taken advantage of, when people are being exploited, when people are being hurt, anger is an emotion that motivates us to do something about that and make society better. I remember being in college and having a friend who really believed that like if they felt anger, it made them like a bad person,
Mm-hmm.
and like they didn't want to feel it. And I was like you're right to be angry. Like if somebody is violating your space or treating you disrespectfully or whatever, like the reason we have anger is so we can stand up for ourselves, is so we can make things right. That doesn't mean we have to like go beat somebody up. We're not going to do that because that's left unchecked. That's fire untamed. However, recognizing that injustice, recognizing that unfairness, and then having anger to motivate us to do something about it, that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's a beautiful thing, like really a beautiful thing, but it's countercultural. And we don't see it. We don't see it. Like it's hard. We don't have models of it because like even the oftentimes appropriate responsive anger that doesn't become chronic and isn't nurtured by a story that then becomes resentment, like even that sometimes is often an overreaction. You know what I mean? And so like we don't have, not general, not cosmically. What I mean is like we in society are, we have not practiced how to express anger in this appropriate way. And so we either tend to not express it and have all the problems that come along with that, or overly express it and then it continues to have this bad rap.
Well, and I think there are examples, like there are models of it, and probably people have done it and used it before. We just don't recognize it as anger.
Okay, yeah,
You know what
let's
I
tell me,
mean?
give me an example of one of these models. I think that would be very beneficial.
Like, I mean, anytime that you hear that something is going wrong in the world and you feel motivated to take action to do something about it, that's coming from anger. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like that, we don't recognize it as anger because that's not like the stereotypical understanding of what anger is. But anger, this is one of the other benefits of anger, is that it is a motivator. It helps us move towards our goals. And sometimes those goals are make society a better place. And
Yeah.
so anytime that you feel like energetically like urgent about making things better, underneath that somewhere is a little bit of frustration and anger around the fact that stuff is like messed up and you don't want it to be messed up and you're mad that it's messed up, you know?
Yeah, totally. Just anger. It's like there's that angst inside you. Like
Mhm.
you may not even say, it might not even feel true to say to yourself, I'm mad that it's messed up, but yet you're
Yeah.
unsettled by the fact that it isn't aligning with your values. And in
Yes.
that sense, you're angered,
Yeah. And so that's
aggravated.
a balanced form. That's a balanced form of anger, which is not going to look like aggression and violence. It's going to look like somebody who is determined.
Yeah, that brings to mind, like, I had this, I don't know if I've told you this story before, but like when I was in high school and I worked at a nursing home in the kitchen. And at one point they like, I was a junior maybe, and they gathered us all in the lobby, like all the kitchen staff and orderlies and whatever, different low level people, like from around the complex or whatever. And they were like,
Okay.
there's been a bomb threat and we don't have time to evacuate. So anyone who's willing, can you go around the building and look for anything out of the ordinary, like a bag or whatever, And like at the time,
Go look for a bomb.
go look for a bomb. Yeah, literally. Like
Like,
I was like, okay, I didn't feel any fear when they were telling me that, but I had this feeling of like, yeah, like because we have to get these people out, And I'm realizing as you talk that I didn't even define the energetic push that I had to go say yes
yeah.
and try to look as anger, but I'm realizing now as we talk and sort of define it more that was anger at the
Yeah.
the person who planted the bomb. And I was like, because like these people are helpless kind of thing. So like I was running around the place, like going up and down all the different stairs, and I come across this gym bag in the, like just in the like one of the landings of like a stairwell, like on the third floor or whatever. And I was like, so I run into the hallway that's right there, and there's nobody around. And I see like a nurse like way, way down the end. I was like, I found the bomb. Like I yelled to her. And then I just go into the nearest room and I start like trying to get the person up. Like, all right, we've got to get out of here. Like I've, And so the nurses are coming running down. And as they get into the room where I am, I'm like lowering the railings and like wheeling a wheelchair over to try to help this like invalid woman who I've never met, like get out of bed. And the nurse is like, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I'm like, "There's a bot. Like, it's right there. Go look. Like, we need to get
Oh
everybody."
my gosh.
How do you not know? Like, I'm like, "What do you mean? What am I doing? What are you doing?" You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And then she's like, "You hold on." And she calls down. I'm like, "I'm not going to hold on." So I'm not holding on. I'm like, she'll figure it out when she catches up to what's the situation, right? And she calls down and then she hangs up and she's like, "It was a drill, sir. There's no bomb," you know? And I was like, "Oh." And so I like lay the one
What?
down. I'm like, "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Have a good, see." Then I was angry in a different way.
Uh-huh. Because then you just went through this whole energetic, like, experience for no reason, and then you're frustrated with the people who did that to you.
Because it was like, I'm literally trying to help this woman with like hip problems. Like, how do you not tell us? But I guess like if they needed it to be a drill, sure. But like even to this day, like it's been 20, maybe almost 30 years since then. I still can't figure out like what was the purpose of that drill. Like when I look back on that memory, I have no idea why that happened. Like,
Oh my gosh.
but there was the anger that I didn't even identify as anger.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah, but anger that motivates you to do something. This is also making or helping me make a connection in terms of, like, if you think about any good origin story for, like, either a villain or a superhero, like,
oh,
I haven't watched these movies very much, but,
okay.
like,
Well,
some
Batman's
people.
parents were shot in the face, so that made him bad.
Yeah, and
You know,
John Wick
like,
had a dog who was given to him by his wife who passed away, and then some villains, like, came in and killed the dog, and so then that was, like, his whole origin story of being, like, a total, you know, badass. Like,
yeah.
people like, when people are wronged, that can motivate their action that they take and their desire to achieve a certain goal, and that, like, obviously we don't want anybody to be like hurt or have to go through like those negative emotions, but like the anger is what creates the motivation to do something about it after you've been wronged.
Yeah. I mean, the benefits of anger, there's so many, like we've talked about, right? Like it provides us information. It helps us
Mhm,
process other feelings if we
mhm,
can stay with it. It protects us and our boundaries. It makes us like when it comes to like injustice and mistreatment, not only does it help us respond to that to protect us, but it also fosters self-awareness about those things. Like the more we
mhm.
experience anger in relation to that, the more we become aware of like, oh, this is what my boundary is, or this is not how I want society to look. And so that fostering of self-awareness is like another really huge benefit to
Mhm.
anxiety. I mean,
Yeah,
anger.
anger.
Yeah.
They're all connected. Yeah. Um, so you mentioned that it can help foster self-awareness, and I feel like there are some questions that we can ask ourselves when we are experiencing anger to help foster that self-awareness. So like when we are feeling angry, first identifying what do I think is making me angry? And then what is it about this thing that is making me angry?
Yeah, exactly. And I was reading something in psychology today and the author wrote about like escaping the anger resentment whirlpool. And like so it's like when you're in anger, if it's veering into the realm of chronic anger, like if you're just having an angry response to something totally justified, just let yourself move through that response and don't judge it because that's fine. That's the whole point. You're
Yeah.
allowed to have that response. If though it's going on and you're starting to lose track of why or you can't seem to let it go, then some of other additional questions that can help wiggle and liberate you are like, what might I also be afraid of, ashamed of,
Mhm.
feeling guilty about, or sad,
Yeah.
sorrowful, or grieving about? If you tune into those, just the
Yeah.
question with genuine curiosity: is there fear here? Is there shame here? Is there guilt here? Or is there grief here? And if there
Yeah.
is, that might be what's required of you to move to in order to let the anger go, because at this point the anger is serving as a proxy, like it's got the
Yeah.
voting shares of your system that the grief is supposed to have, and you need to give those votes back to grief.
Yeah. Yeah, but making the choice to, like, move to those or even explore those kind of, I think, requires recognizing how, like, long-term chronic anger that you're not able to let go of, like negatively affects your health or negatively affects your relationships. And that brings me to like an example from my own life in that I was having an argument with someone at one point, somebody who was like chronically angry, had been angry like for a long, long time. And there was this moment when like in a like moment of like anger, they like took their cell phone and like threw it, like whipped it like a baseball. And there were like two things kind of going on, like in terms of like the relationship to anger in that moment, like them exerting that, them throwing the thing helped them calm down because it released some of the energy. But it also triggered my nervous system. It also triggered my flight response and affected the relationship because now I'm afraid of this person. So it's a good thing that they chose to like throw it elsewhere. They didn't direct the anger at me, but even if the anger is not directed at me, I can still feel afraid. I can still like see that display of anger, and it'll cause me to feel differently about the person or cause me to feel my own nervous system reaction. So while their nervous system is experiencing a calming effect because they have released the energy, mine almost gets a transfer of that energy, not directly. They didn't like give me the energy, but the display of it then created energy in my own body that does not support our relationship.
Yeah, so I love that example because that's good segue into just touching on briefly, like, while anger has benefits for the person who needs to express it, it still has impacts for the larger environment, even if you express it in a way that is quote unquote not violent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or not harmful. Like, one could make an argument that throwing the cell phone is still aggressive, and aggressiveness is like anger. It's still anger taken beyond. But also, like, that's also a step back from throwing it at you, like you just said, right? And so it's important to understand, like, we can express anger in a way that causes that calming release in us, but we still have to be prepared for what the larger impacts of that are on the people around us, depending on who it is in our lives and where we want them to be in our lives, so that we understand, like, if I want to have you in my life and that kind of stuff triggers you, then I need to think differently about how I express my anger around you, especially if we've communicated that to each other. But this is another place where it's self-awareness becomes so key, because we want to find healthy ways to express anger. That's like the biggest point, I think, of this episode for Mo and I, is like, you have to feel it. It's not to be avoided. It's not to be ignored. It's not to be judged.
Yeah.
And it's like fire. So, like, feel it, but you have to wear gloves. You have to use poles. You have to use tongs. There's all kind of rules. There's safety measures. It can totally go too far. Anger is a big one, right?
Yeah.
So it's got this, the truth is you can't avoid it or you burn up inside. But the other truth is you can't just willy-nilly throw it around or everyone around you burns up.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the balanced, careful way of feeling it is allowing the sensations in your body and then exploring it, asking where it's coming from, creating some form of like discovery about like what created this, what's the root of it, which then a lot of times will allow that emotion to convert into whatever other emotion it is covering up. And if you're able to feel any amount of the emotion that it's covering up, you're going to get a lot more energy release from that.
Yeah.
Like, you get a little bit of temporary energy release from it's like I don't know much about this, but like when people like burp their like brews that they're making, I don't know what I'm even referring to, but like sometimes if you're like fermenting something, I think I've seen people like need to.
You just gotta burp your
fermented
emotions, guys.
Yeah, you just like well, anger is like burping it, but it doesn't completely alleviate the pressure.
Yeah,
So
right.
it's like,
if you experience the real
other
one,
emotions are fermenting in here, and they're like becoming this whole concoction that is going to stay in the jar. The anger is just the pressure release.
yeah, that's
You
beautiful.
want to dump out the jar if you can, eventually.
because every emotion provides a release. Like if you feel the emotion that's appropriate to the situation, like the emotion that most aligns with the truth of how you really feel, instead of avoiding it or pretending it or smushing it back, it always comes with a release. Like that's the truth of every emotion. But because they're hard to go through, we don't feel them, and then we bottle them up, and then we don't get the release. Instead, we get some
Yeah.
other chronic weird manifestation, and then society is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is also, again, why anger is so important, because if you're not able to feel anger and also not able to feel any of the more difficult emotions, health issues.
Yeah. So express it. And I guess my final thought on this would be, as an exercise, if people want to take this away from the listen, it would be to, when you feel angry, allow it to take its course and pass through you, and
Mhm.
become curious about what was behind it. What was the precursor that made you feel vulnerable or threatened or both? And then investigate
Mhm.
that too.
Yeah. And also be aware of, if there's anyone around you that you love, think about whatever way you're choosing to express it. Is that going to affect my relationship? Is it going to create a fight or flight response in the other person? Because we want to be really careful about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Exactly. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
So thank you, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate it. We will be back again next week to go deeper into emotions, some other emotion. You're going to have to wait and see.
Mhm.
If you want to learn more about Mo and what she does, you can find her online at selfloveatlas.coach or on Instagram at Morgan_Barbrett. And if you want to learn more about me and what I do, you can find me at thebrianhogan.com or on the social media platforms at thebrianhogan. In the meantime, we will be back again next Friday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Until then, be
Mhm.
happy, messy, and be blessed. Much love.